Welcome to our third lecture covering the Fair Labor Standards Act. Let's begin. During our first two lectures, we covered an overview of the statute in our first lecture, and then our second lecture, we covered minimum wage and what that means. Now we're going to move on to overtime wage calculation and the various exemptions to the FLSA. So let's get started. Let's scroll ahead to slide 44. Here we go, overtime pay. So the FLSA does not restrict the number of hours that an employee can work. It does not permit an employee to decline overtime. So it is perfectly okay for an employer to insist that a worker work overtime. The only times that it really could become unlawful would be situations in which the person has a disability and there might need to be a reasonable accommodation, or I suppose in extreme circumstances the general duty clause of the Occupational Safety and Health Act could play a role. But as a general rule, if an employer wants an employee to work overtime, the employee should do so or possibly risk losing his or her position. Now that's a federal rule. There are different rules under various state laws, although Texas does not have a different rule. Of course, if a person is non-exempt, then once he or she has worked 40 hours, he or she becomes eligible to be paid time and a half for the time worked in excess of 40 hours. Let's stop for a second and look at this term, non-exempt. This is a double negative, and we will talk more about it going forward, but I'm going to save it just for a second, but just kind of make a mental notation because some folks get this term a little bit confused in their heads, and so we'll talk about this in a bit. Let's consider two scenarios here. So employees of the skunk company work long hours during road construction projects to take advantage of good weather and to complete the work on schedule. During one particular week, a few workers worked close to 65 hours each. For such employees, skunk must pay time and a half for the time worked in excess of 40 hours. So if the worker worked 65 hours, then 40 hours would be at straight time and 15 hours would be at time and a half. Let's consider Mary. Mary's a cashier. During the holiday season, she regularly works 60 hours a week. The company is going to satisfy the requirements of the FLSA if they pay her for time and a half for all the hours over 40. In these situations, the road construction crews and cashiers are going to fit into that category that we've already described without definition as non-exempt. Let's consider how we decide. In these examples, we just talked about that these individuals worked 40 hours in a week. But what do we know a week is? How do we define a week? Well, week follows the definition that we ordinarily use in the United States, which is the week starts at 12:01 a.m. on Sunday morning. And then it would end at 11:59 p.m. on Saturday night. Those are 7 24-hour periods adding up to 169 hours. The work week needs to be fixed and a regular period. That's the assumption. There is some opportunity for employers to vary that schedule, but it's pretty rarely done. The actual schedule that you have can become problematic if there is some kind of switch in an organization. Imagine for a second that you happen to have two work crews. One work crew works during the day, the other works at night. And because you want to even it up, there might be 2 weeks a year where you flip the population. So the population that's been working during the day is now working at night, and the population that's been working at night is now working during the day. During that flip time, though, you might find that some workers work somewhat less than 40 hours and some workers work somewhat more than 40 hours simply because of how the nights fall in terms of schedules. And so if you are going to set up that type of organization, you'll need to be prepared to pay a little bit of overtime or maybe a significant amount of overtime for those flip weeks, even though from the perspective of the employees, they're just working 40 hours. It just so happens that they worked, a few more hours one week versus another week. You don't get to kind of average out the time over several different weeks. There have been moves at time in the Congress to permit some kind of averaging system. We actually have that with firefighters and some other workers who do have somewhat unusual schedules. Many people think that this would be a benefit for work-life balance situations. Unions have generally opposed this, thinking that, or their perception being that having this type of averaging would tend to lower the income of employees. Many employees, though, especially in white-collar situations, would like to have that flexibility. Imagine for a second that you want to take off Thursday and Friday of next week so that you can attend a wedding out of town. You have to leave work right on time on Wednesday, so you can't work any more than 8 hours on Wednesday, and it's just not possible to get in 40 hours of work on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. So you're going to have to either take be docked pay for that particular week because you're not going to get to 40, or you're going to have to take some vacation time or something. What you might like to do is you might want to ask your boss, hey boss, can I work a little bit more than 40 hours the week before? So let's say I might work, we'll say I might work 50 hours the week before, and then I will work, say 11 hours on the Monday, 11 hours on the Tuesday, and 8 hours on the Wednesday. So I ultimately end up for those 2 weeks working 80 hours. Well, your boss is likely to say, no, I can't authorize you to work more than 40 because then I'd have to pay you time and a half for all those hours over 40. And so you can see how there could be times, there will be times actually, where an employee would like to forego the overtime pay so that he or she can get to the 40-hour point over some period of time. But the law at this time does not permit that type of flexibility. There are certain types of compensation that are excluded from regular compensation. Some businesses give an annual bonus, and this is called a Christmas bonus or end-of-year bonus. There can be gifts that employers give. I guess that's kind of what a Christmas bonus is. But if the bonus is tied to some type of activity that the employee has to perform, for example, let's say it's a perfect attendance bonus or it's a productivity bonus, then let's say it's a perfect attendance bonus for the year. Then in some sense, the employee was earning that bonus every single week of that year, assuming, let's say at the end of the year, he or she actually got paid the $100 or whatever. Well, in some sense, then about $2 a week over the course of that year should be attributed to that week. So you can see how that presents a lot of logistical problems because you don't know whether that employee is actually going to earn the bonus until the end of the year. So you don't really consider him or her having earned that extra $2 a week. So then at the end of the year, for those who actually did earn the bonus, then you have to go back and retroactively adjust any overtime pay they did by attributing that $2-ish, I guess it's slightly less than $2, to each one of those weeks, which would then slightly raise their regular pay, and then would mean that they would earn slightly more in overtime pay. So you can see how that presents some challenging issues. It can even present additional issues in that you're actually perhaps going to be paying these individuals the following year under those circumstances at the next year. So you're actually paying in the following year for work performed in the previous year. So there's several issues to consider as you decide how to structure your compensation. That's one of the reasons why bonuses based upon performance need to be carefully considered. They can be very motivational to employees and they can be a smart idea, but they do raise some challenging payroll issues that need to be worked out before you proceed with such a plan. So here's an example of this particular person. We'll say Bob worked 48 hours in a week. His base or hourly rate is $10 an hour. He actually also got a bonus this week of $10. Let's say this is a bonus because he had performed his job especially well or something. Okay, so we take 48 times 9. That gets us this number. Then we add the $10. So of course this becomes 442. Now we're going to divide it by the number of hours that he works, and we're going to see that his pay rate is actually not $9 but $9.21 because of this $10 bonus. And so we've already paid him, because we calculate based upon the 40 days, we've already paid him his straight time. So now we have to pay him this half time for those 8 hours beyond the 40 hours. So what is his half time rate? Well, it would be his hourly rate times half, which would be 461. So we're going to take 461 and multiply it by 8, and that would get us his overtime amount. So we would need to add this amount to this amount to actually get Bob his correct payment for that pay period. So that's our discussion about overtime wages. As I said before, this can be a tricky thing to calculate. It requires a fairly good understanding of how the math works, and again, as a result, because it would involve lots of opportunities for there to be a miscalculation or error, it makes sense to automate this process, but you have to make sure that the automation has the data that is necessary to make this actually make all the numbers work together well. So it is something that requires a fair amount of attention to detail and an understanding of what the law requires. Okay, let's flip on over and talk about exemptions to the FLSA. Remember I used the term non-exempt a couple of minutes ago? Well, now we're going to talk about who's exempt. So if you think about it, all of the employees that you might have in your organization fit into one or another category. They're either exempt or they're non-exempt. You know, it's a little bit like either either you're a left-handed person or a right-handed person. That's not actually a good example, because there are some people who are ambidextrous. There are no people who are both exempt and non-exempt in the same position. So, for example, you're either I'm trying to avoid controversial ones. The ones I'm thinking about are, you're either, say, under 18 or over 18. There's nobody who is both under 18 and over 18. So you fall into one category or another, but the distinctions aren't always clear. So it may be hard to know which bucket this person goes in, but one is the right bucket and one is the wrong bucket. So exempt people are exempt from the FLSA overtime rules. So they don't apply. So when we use the term exempt employees, we mean employees for whom employers do not have to pay overtime, for whom the FLSA overtime rules do not apply. They are exempt from those particular requirements. So non-exempt, which sounds like a double negative, and it is. It's a very inartful expression, but it's the one we use, so we're stuck with it. And a non-exempt person is somebody who is not excluded. So that means he's included, right? The rules do apply to him. So a double negative becomes a positive, right? So non-exempt people, the employer has to follow the rules about overtime pay with respect to them. So the rules don't apply to the exempt folks. The rules do apply to the non-exempt folks. Non-exempt workers are entitled to overtime pay. If you don't have a good grasp of this idea, I encourage you to spend a little bit of time thinking about it, because as an HR professional or a paralegal, you are going to be a paralegal in the HR area. You're going to be hearing these terms just routinely given, and you need to be able to make sure you understand who's in which category. Let's go forward from here. So there were some changes to the regulations back in 2016 that were supposed to kick in. This was before when President Obama was president, these regulations were considered to be changed, and they were not put into effect. And I don't think that they're very likely to ever be put into effect. Now, I'm not advocating for those changes, for or against those particular changes, but I will tell you that the FLSA regulations were written in the 30s and 40s in many cases. And the economy that we had, the job positions that existed, were very, very profoundly different than what we see today. And so the regulations really aren't a very good fit. They're not a good fit because they don't reflect our economy. They're also not a good fit because it's very difficult for employers to know whether they're in compliance or not. And of course, that's not a good system to have. What we want when we're the government, we want rules that are easy for employers to apply to their workforce. That makes sense because we want employers to comply, and the easier it is, the better for everybody. So there are real opportunities, and I think everyone would agree that there are real opportunities and real changes that need to be made. Whether these regulatory changes were good ideas or bad ideas, reasonable people have differing perspectives on it. But whether they were or not, they're not going to be put into effect at this time, and I would not expect that they'll be put into effect in the short term. So as a result, we're going to talk about the old rules, not these proposed rules. If at some point these rules do go into effect, obviously that's going to be a very dramatic change in some of these definitions, and so we'll have to revisit the topic at that time. As a HR professional or a paralegal, you do need to stay abreast of the news in this area, because this is an area that really should change, and probably should change in the not too distant future, and hopefully will change in some way. Whatever that change looks like, it needs to happen. And so what we're covering today may well not be what the law looks like in 5 years, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, so let's look at some thresholds. One threshold is that there are workers who fall in the category of earning less than $23,660 dollars per year. And another way of looking at that is $455 per week. The statute just gives this amount. This is the number. So, you know, it's not adjusted for inflation. As you can imagine, back in the 30s or 40s, $455 a week was a fairly good income. Obviously, money went farther at that time than it would go today. Nowadays, we look upon someone earning $23,000, $24,000 and see that as an entry-level position, perhaps in many industries, not even an entry-level position. So this is an example of how the FLSA hasn't kept up with the inflation that's happened. This is what we call the salary basis test. The first thing we look at to see whether somebody is exempt or not is whether they earn enough money to even be considered for exemption. If I'm below this amount, if I'm an employee and I earn less than this amount, I am going to be eligible for overtime pay no matter what I do. There's no job out there that if I earn less than this, I'm going to be considered exempt. I mean, that makes sense, because if I'm being paid such a little amount of money, it's hard to see. I mean, that's the population that is intended to be protected by the overtime pay statutes. Now you might think, well, what if I'm part-time? I mean, what if I only work, 5 hours a week? I mean, that's a pretty good amount of pay right there, right? If I'm only working 5 hours a week. Well, if that were the case, but I'm still earning a total of $23,660 or below that number, then I would be eligible for overtime. Now, would I ever actually earn any overtime? Probably not, because I'm only become eligible for overtime once I hit 40 plus hours. Now I suppose you could have some very strange job wherein you work an hour or two a week, and then you have a week where you work 60 hours, and then you have an hour or two a week for a few more weeks, and then you work 60 hours. I mean, I suppose it's possible to think of such a job, but that wouldn't be a typical type of arrangement. There's another category of folks who are at the other end of income, and these are folks who earn at least $100,000. And these folks, when we evaluate them, we have to consider their income as well as what their job duties are. And if they have job duties that are consistent with their income, then they're going to automatically be exempt. But folks between these amounts, between our bottom number of $23,660 and $100,000, this is our category of folks that it could go either way, that they could be exempt or they could be non-exempt, and so we need to do quite a bit more analysis. We'll also see that there's one other dollar amount that falls into this group that applies to a certain category of employees, particularly computer employees. So we'll break these up. But again, this one is definitely not going to, if you're below this, you're definitely not going to be exempt. If you're over this, you probably are, although there could be some weird situations where you wouldn't be. And if you're in between these sums, we're just going to have to do a more detailed, very fact-specific analysis. So let's consider Mary. Mary is a cab driver, traditionally a non-exempt position. Many cab drivers are actually small business owners. They own their cab, so that we're not talking about that situation. We're talking about a cab driver who's an employee. She's paid on an hourly basis. She earns less than $20,000 a year, and she regularly works 10 to 15 hours of overtime each week. Unfortunately for Mary, she is not paid any overtime, and she receives very few tips, so the tip rules don't apply to her. Under these circumstances, Mary should be paid overtime because she earns less than this amount. Honestly, even if she earned more than this amount and she's in this middle category, she isn't going to fit into any of the exemptions we're going to talk about. But this is an easy call. This is the first piece of the analysis. Do the salary basis test first to see that, and then, if necessary, do a drill down from there. So let's say we're in that middle area. We earn more than the 23, but less than $100,000. Now we have to do a pretty detailed analysis of what this particular employee does. And it really does need to be that specific. I mean, sometimes there will be categories of folks who all pretty much do the same work. Imagine an assembly line or, a second grade teacher position or something like that. But then there are other times where people might have the same position, but they do wildly different things. Imagine a secretary to Bob who writes his memos, who is actively involved in giving him advice about decisions that ought to be made, versus somebody else whose only job is to type, to actually manually type whatever Bob dictates to, or Sally dictates to her. And so you have to consider not just what the job title says or what most people in the job do, but we're looking at what this particular incumbent does to the job. Things to consider when you're making this analysis, when you have both exempt and non-exempt duties, is what's the percentage of time between the two. Now, in some places, I think California is one, the percentages is really, really important. Under the FLSA, it's one of the factors to be considered, but it's not a deal breaker. So I might do slightly more non-exempt work in terms of percentage of my day, but the most important stuff I do may be my exempt work. And so because it's so much more important, so much more essential to my job function, I might still be more exempt than not, even if the hours a day in one category versus another tend towards the non-exempt category. So the relative importance is also important. Another factor is how free is this particular employee from direct supervision. The more direct supervision, the more this person looks like a non-exempt person. So we talked already about the salary basis test. This is the first thing we look to. This is that floor, that 23,660. You do this first, because if it's below this, you don't have to do anything else. But if it's above this, then now we're going to be doing the duties test. We're going to consider whether this particular employee genuinely fits into one of the categories that can be exempt from the FLSA. Again, keep in mind, we're not looking at job title. We're not looking at position description. We're looking at what this person really and truly does. Sometimes position descriptions are not very accurate, certainly not for an individual in this position. They may have been accurate at one point, but the job may have changed over time. Of course, another requirement is that the position has to be paid on a salaried basis. You can't pay someone on an hourly basis and then deny them overtime pay at the 1.5 times rate. That's just not an option under the law. So your choices are hourly paid with overtime pay based upon people working over 40 hours, or salaried basis with no overtime pay if the person otherwise qualifies. Now, an interesting issue is, can I take somebody who would ordinarily be exempt and pay them an hourly basis or a commission or a piece rate type of situation? Absolutely. You can always move someone from an exempt position to a non-exempt position. But it gets confusing and potentially problematic if you have people in multiple categories. Bob and Sally do the same stuff. If you're paying Bob on an hourly basis, you probably need to pay Sally on an hourly basis, because Bob's existence as an hourly paid associate is going to make it likely that they will find Sally should be paid on an hourly basis as well. Okay, so imagine that we've decided that this person is satisfying the duties test and the salary basis test, so they should be exempt. But let's say for whatever reason we want to reduce their pay for a particular week. There's a pay docking rule. Of course, in this context, we're saying when we're docking someone's pay, we're reducing it to what it should be. Now, we don't think about pay docking when we're talking about hourly associates, because it's just a matter of how many hours they worked. I mean, that number is probably going to vary from week to week. It's not going to be exactly 40.0 every single week. It might be 39.8 one week and it's 40.2 the next. And if a person just doesn't come on a certain day, it might be significantly less. We don't think about that as pay docking, but imagine a situation where we have somebody who's absolutely exempt, who's ordinarily paid on a salaried basis, but who has maybe an absence of some type, or maybe they did something, they broke a rule, and we want to have there be a consequence associated with it. Well, there are very specific rules about how we can dock under those situations. If you dock incorrectly, you risk the exempt status of that particular worker for some period of time, and you possibly put at risk everybody in that category's exempt status if your policies permit pay docking, even if you don't do it. So you have to be very careful in this area and make sure your policies are consistent with the law. For example, one situation that you cannot do a pay docking is for partial week absences for illness. If Bob is out with the flu, he ordinarily works Monday through Friday. He calls in sick on, or leaves work early on Thursday, and because he's sick, and then he doesn't come in on Friday. He's back to work on Monday, so he missed a day and a half. You have to pay him his normal salaried amount. Obviously, if he were hourly paid, you'd only pay him the time that he worked, unless, of course, your particular place of employment offers some kind of sick pay benefit. So under the salary basis test, again, this is that test that requires that the person be paid at least this amount and that they truly are paid a salary. The employee must regularly receive a predetermined amount of compensation each pay period. And it can be a weekly basis or a less frequent basis. It's not unusual to find managers who are paid on a monthly basis. Well, some months have 31 days, some months have 28 days. But you should not be paying that person less for February than you're paying somebody that same person in March, for example. Now, another way that we see this happening is a biweekly pay or twice monthly pay. And again, so biweekly, obviously, you're just going to have 14 days per cycle, but if it's twice monthly, you have that same issue of dividing the month in half, and not all of our months have the same number of days. So keep that in mind when you're designing your pay programs. So let's look at a couple of the exceptions from the no pay docking rule that we just talked about. Absence from work for one or more full days for personal reasons other than sickness or disability. So let's say I choose to be absent all day on Friday because my daughter is getting married out of town and I want to be there helping her with that. Well, it's a full day and it has nothing to do with sickness or disability. Let's say I don't have any vacation time left, or I'm not eligible for vacation time. That would be a situation in which my pay could be docked. Whether the particular employer chooses to do that or not is a different issue. Partial days, let's say I leave I leave work Friday at 11 p.m. to make my plane so I can go out to where my daughter's wedding is. That partial day absence cannot result in pay docking. Now, my employer doesn't have to permit me to do that. It can say, no, you got to be here until the end of the day or whenever we tell you you need to be here. So the employer doesn't have to permit it, but if the employer does permit it, then I have to be paid the full time. So let's consider the categories of exemptions. We actually have 5. There's one more I'm going to kind of write in here, and this is a computer professional. We'll talk more about this one. We'll talk briefly about this one too. So the first one is executive exemption. Another is administrative exemption. The third is a professional exemption. We'll see we actually have 2 categories of this one. And then we have the outside sales professional. And finally, we have the computer professional. Sometimes a particular position may satisfy multiple of these, but it's not necessary. A person only needs to fits into one of these categories. So let's go forward and find out more about them. The first one we're going to cover is the executive exemption. We'll see many of the terminology for these exemptions, especially the first 2, are very misleading. I don't know if our vocabulary has changed that much or if the legislators who passed this law just picked some weird words, but the words are not telling in this area. When I think executive, I think CEO. I think of somebody with lots of power, lots of prestige, probably a big paycheck. But the executive exemption to the FLSA is very, very minor. Most people who fit into this exemption are really just supervisors. So what do we need? Well, the first thing is we have to satisfy that salary basis test, which, let's be honest, these days, $23,000. If you're a supervisor and you're not earning more than $23,000 in your full-time position, you probably need to get a raise, right? So that's usually very easily satisfied. The next one's a little bit trickier, and this is that the executive must customarily and regularly direct the work of 2 or more employees. And the employees have to add up to 80 hours a week on average. And even the average requirement, it's not so much average as it's probably okay if there's the occasional week where it drops below 80. Let's say that this executive manages Sally and Bob. Well, they both usually work 40 hours a week, but in a particular week, Sally wanted to leave work early on Thursday, and so she only worked 35 hours. Okay, so for that week, the supervisor or the executive only supervised 75 hours. A one-off week, that's going to be okay, but you want that to definitely be an exception. If the 2 workers are part-time, then that's not going to work because, again, we have to get to the 80 hours. But you could have several part-time workers, and when you add up all of their hours, they add up to 80, then you're okay. Now, there's a problem with the executive exemption I'd like to bring your attention to, and this oftentimes comes up. You set up a particular position as exempt, as under the executive exemption, and you assign this person 2 or 3 or 4 workers. Maybe they're all full-time. You're comfortably above the 80-hour requirement. But that department's function maybe is diminished, or there's cutbacks, and so the decision is to reduce the hours in that department, or perhaps there's some technological advance that allows you to accomplish the same amount of work with fewer bodies. And so time passes, and suddenly or slowly that person is moving from managing 120 hours to 100 hours a week to 90 hours a week to 80 hours a week to 70 hours a week. Well, the problem is that nobody notices when you fall below the 80. There's nobody who's intimately focused on this. The supervisor probably doesn't even know 80 is a critical time. The HR professional may not even be aware that there's been this drop in the hours. And so this situation can continue for some time before anyone notices. And yet this person is completely not exempt. Well, oftentimes what happens is when the executive finds that his or her staff is dropped below 80 hours, the executive now has to work more because he or she has to pick up the slack and do some of the work that he used to have subordinates to do. So he's likely to be working more than 40 hours a week. He's likely to be in the overtime category. Well, lo and behold, now he's entitled to overtime because he no longer satisfies the executive exemption. So you can see how this is an important area to monitor to make sure you aren't having folks fall out of this exemption. In addition to managing the 80 hours a week, the executive employee must also have the authority to hire or fire other employees, namely these 80 hours, or be able to recommend as to hiring, firing, advancement, promotion, or some other change of employee status, and that recommendation be given particular weight. In other words, it's not just oh yeah, we'll listen to what you have to say. No, I mean, usually this employee is taken very seriously and his or her recommendations are implemented. Maybe not every time, but not infrequently. So you need to have both of these things. This is an and situation, not an or situation. As you can see, the term executive doesn't really fit with how you and I think of executives in the everyday world, but that's okay because you're allowed to have different definitions. So here's some examples of things that would qualify as managing. See what we have here? We have the idea of managing folks. These would be examples of things that would qualify as managing folks for the executive exemption. Okay, let's consider the administrative exemption. This is another one that is confusing, but it's confusing in the opposite way. If you are in a white-collar environment very long, you will soon hear people refer to their secretary as their admin or their administrative assistant. So you may think that when you see the administrative exemption that you're saying, oh, secretaries must be exempt from overtime rules. Absolutely not. Secretaries are non-exempt folks. The administrative exemption is actually the opposite. It has the opposite meaning as to what we attribute in everyday conversation to an admin. So let's break it down so we can see what the statute says it means. So an employee fits into the administrative exemption when the employee has the primary duty, so this is mainly why he or she is there, performing office or non-manual work directly related to the management or general business operations of the employer or its customers. So he's not doing a sideline task. He's doing something that's going to the heart of the business as his primary duty. He may have other duties, but this is the big deal. This is the reason why we have this position. This first part, and let's go to the second part. In the exercise of this primary duty, he regularly exercises, and these are the key words, discretion and independent judgment with respect to matters of significance. And the rule has to be over 50%. So don't be thrown by the word administrative. It actually means the opposite of what a secretary does, because a secretary is not using discretion and independent judgment with respect to matters of significance. So what does discretion, independent judgment not include? It doesn't include applying well-established techniques, procedures. It doesn't include clerical or secretarial work. It doesn't include recording or tabulating data or performing mechanical, repetitive, recurrent, or routine work. It really does need to be judgment-oriented, where you could pick either thing, and you're going to pick A, okay, that's fine, or you're going to pick B, okay, that's fine. If you're just applying a well-established technique, then there's a right answer. You're supposed to pick A. You might make a mistake and pick B, but you messed up then. But when you have independent judgment, neither path is a mess up, at least not in terms of what you know at that time. You may decide later on, oh, I should have done X or Y or Z, but it wasn't that you were violating your direction when you did that. So let's consider the example of a human resources professional. This person is going to meet the administrative exemption. This person is not. So human resource managers who formulate, interpret, or implement employment policies generally meet the administrative duties requirement. So let's say your job is to decide whether people are exempt or non-exempt. And so you evaluate their work sample, you visit the facility, you talk with them, you talk with their supervisors, you look at their work output. That would be an example of administrative you would be an administrative person. Let's say that you are a personnel clerk and your job is to screen applicants, and so what you're looking for is, has this person graduated from high school and did this person score at least a 70 on a math test? Well, yeah, you're screening the person, but you know exactly what the cutoffs are. There's no discretion there. If a person scores 69, they didn't pass. If a person still is in their final semester of high school, they haven't graduated. And so under those circumstances, the personnel clerk would not be an administrative employee. Another exemption might fit. I'm not going to focus on this particular case. For one thing, I consider the result kind of weird. It's not the typical answer. But I think it's interesting insofar as it shows you how detailed this stuff is. The courts really dive into the minutia, and that's what they expect the HR professional to do, or the legal department, depending upon how these functions are divided up in the organization, to make sure that the categorizations are appropriate. And there may, again, need to be a review of this over time. Things that once involved independent judgment, there may be a new boss who now has these hard and fast rules about how we handle these matters. And so a person who was an administrative employee under the Act may cease to be an administrative employee and therefore should be paid on an hourly basis. So these need to be reviewed from time to time. Okay, so we've talked about the first two of our categories: executive and administrative. And as you can see, it's not unusual for a person to potentially fall into both of these categories, but it's only necessary they fit into one or the other. Now we're going to go on and talk about the professional. There's actually two categories of professional. Usually, we're going to talk about the learned professional first. And when we say learned, what we mean is this is somebody who has had some level of education that has made them a professional in this area. And typically there's a license involved. You have to pass a test in order to fit into this category ordinarily. So we see attorneys, doctors, registered nurses, accountants, engineers, architects, pharmacists, and teachers. You can see in all categories they have to have developed some portfolio or some credentials so that they are able to be involved in this. Now, let's consider the example of a teacher. Typically in most states, and this is true in Texas, a person needs to have a teaching certificate in order to teach. There may be some exceptions made for certain specialties, or there may be some kind of temporary credential that a person has, but they eventually are going to need to develop the official credentials in order to continue in that role. But I could be a teacher in a preschool and I don't need those credentials. Or I could be a teacher at a private school. I don't need to have those credentials. So in that situation, the learned professional exemption might not apply. So those are some things to think about. Now, sometimes within these disciplines, there may be what we call a paraprofessional. Somebody who assists the professional, the person with that credential, with that license, but doesn't have the same requirements that we see. So for example, there may be a lower level of nurse, for example, a phlebotomist or a practical nurse. There might be an accountant who has not passed the CPA yet. There might be a draftsperson who helps the architect. There might be a pharmacy tech who helps the pharmacist. There might be a teacher's aide who helps the teacher. There might be a paralegal or legal assistant who helps the attorney. All of those positions are usually going to fall into the paraprofessional category. An example is the paralegal position, one that is fairly controversial, this designation, but the Department of Labor says that paralegals should be paid ordinarily on an hourly basis. In part because, well, pretty much exclusively because they don't need a license in order to be a paralegal, and not all paralegals have a 4-year degree, a baccalaureate degree. And so, and but a significant number of paralegals don't have even any formal training in the law. And so the Department of Labor says, as a result, this whole category ought to be treated as people who do not fit the professional exemption. Now, they might fit another exemption. The Department of Labor would say, yeah, I mean, they might be an executive. So let's say you have a paralegal who supervises the file room personnel, the receptionist, the secretary. Well, that paralegal would be an executive, not because he or she's a paralegal, but because he or she is managing and making employment decisions about that population. Or the paralegal might be an administrative person. Let's say in addition to his or her paralegal responsibilities, he or she manages the office in terms of entering into contracts for office space, photocopy agreements, things along those lines. So he or she may be an administrative person, but again, that would be separate from the duties of being a paralegal. They aren't going to typically fall into the professional category. Let's consider Mary. Mary's a recent law school graduate, and she's employed at a law firm which has 200 employees. Mary is paid $98,000 per year. Like most associates, she regularly works 60 or more hours a week. She thinks she should be provided overtime pay for all those extra hours that she's putting in. Unfortunately for her, she qualifies as a learned professional, and she is exempt from overtime provisions of the FLSA. Let's consider the second category. So we talked about learned professionals. That's category 1 of the professional exemption. The second is creative professionals. And these are employees whose primary duty must be the performance of work requiring invention, imagination, originality, or talent in a recognized field of artistic or creative endeavor. People like musicians, creative writers, actors, painters, photographers. And you can see what the challenge is here. Imagine that you are a symphony orchestra and you have rehearsals, obviously, where all of the woodwinds get together and practice, or all of the strings get together and practice. But you also expect these workers to be practicing independently. They need to get the music down and memorized and be familiar with all the different subtle things that they need to work on to have mastered the music independently. Most likely that work isn't going to happen at the symphony hall. For one thing, it would be very distracting for me to be working on measure 14 and somebody's working on measure 97. And so I'm guessing here that most professional musicians work out of their homes or their apartments to really fine-tune those skills. Well, that now means that the employer won't know how many hours Lucille worked on her flute for that week. I mean, Lucille can report it, but maybe she's being accurate, maybe she's not. The symphony really doesn't care how many hours Lucille spends. They care about how well she plays. If she can, only practice for 2 hours and still plays very, very well, then that's great. If she needs 20 hours to play at that level, then that's what she needs to do. And so the focus isn't upon the number of hours, but upon the level of performance. And it's hard to know what that number is going to be like, because it's going to vary depending upon the method of preparation, the particular skills and aptitude that the artist has. So these are another category of folks who are exempt from the overtime pay. So they qualify as exempt employees. This is just a summary of what we've kind of already talked about with respect to the categories. Let's consider the fourth category. Let me flip back here for a second. So now we've talked about the 2 categories of professionals. We've talked about the administrative exemption and the executive exemption. Now we're up to the outside sales professional exemption. To do this, the person needs to have the responsibility of generating sales. They don't need a particular education or credential. They don't need to manage anybody. They don't need to be making any kind of independent decisions. So they really don't fit into the other categories usually at all. I mean, I guess it's possible that a person could fit into more than one exemption, and one of those being the outside sales, but most of the time this is pretty much its own thing. The thing that is distinctive about the outside sales is the word outside, because as you can imagine, the word outside means that the person must customarily and regularly be engaged away from the employer's business in performing this duty. So when we say outside, we don't mean like they're working outside, like a road construction crew would be, although I suppose they could be, but they're outside of the place of business. They may well be doing all their work inside, they're just not doing it inside the employer's place of business. Maybe they're visiting various, let's say I sell software to various companies. I might be doing visits at various and sundry office buildings and doing presentations, for examples, or sales calls of various types. Well, that would make me an outside salesperson. A pharmacy rep, a pharmaceutical rep who goes from doctor's office to doctor's office would fit into that category. So the reason that we have this exemption is not really having to do with the nature of the job. It has to do, though, more with the fact that it would be very, very difficult to keep track of these individuals' hours. How do we know that Bob really visited that doctor's office? How do we know that Sally really made that presentation to that potential customer? I mean, we can take Sally's or Bob's word for it, sure, but if we're talking about money, that's maybe not the most reliable way of doing it. And we don't really want to go to this potential customer and say, did he really come? I mean, that doesn't seem like it's going to be a very effective way of doing this. And keep in mind, nowadays we have tools like a GPS and telephone, cell phone, and things like that. But when these rules came out, there were no cell phones. Many businesses wouldn't have even had a phone necessarily in its place of business. So there really wouldn't have been much in the way of the ability of the employer to confirm the hours worked. And so this exemption is really just a function of the fact that we just can't manage, and we just don't know how many hours this person was working. Now we're up to our last exemption, that computer exemption, the one that wasn't actually on the list, but I kind of added. The reason that it wasn't on the initial list was that this is a new exemption. And it has to do with computers. Obviously, in 1938, there weren't computers, or at least there weren't many computers, and certainly there weren't a common job responsibility. Here's language about what that computer professional needs to do, but it's not enough that he or she does this. There's actually more than one qualification for this. You'll see that this isn't somebody who's your LAN administrator. This isn't somebody who troubleshoots when you can't get the printer to work. This is pretty sophisticated stuff that is really for somebody who's pretty highly trained, probably someone with a college degree in computer science or electrical engineering or something along those lines. Then the other thing that we need is for the computer exempt person to be earning at least $913 per week or more. And this works out, as you can see, to be quite a bit more than what the salary basis test is. So why do we require that the computer person earn so much more than the salary basis? I think it's more of a function of the fact that this exemption came a lot later. And so when they were writing the exemption, they said, wait a second, this $455 number doesn't make any sense for this exemption. They perhaps didn't have the political will to revisit the entire $455 a week level, and so they decided, well, we're just going to carve out a special guaranteed salary level for the computer professional. And in most cases, if a person is really doing this, all of this stuff, he or she is likely to be paid at least this amount of money. But it's an and situation, not an or. You need to satisfy both of these requirements in order to fit into this computer exemption. So again, it doesn't include employees who are routinely engaged in operating computers. So if all I'm doing is turning it on and word processing or doing Excel spreadsheets or things like that, not going to qualify. And it doesn't, it doesn't count that if I'm manufacturing them or I'm repairing them or engaged in routine maintenance. It's not that type of stuff that's going to qualify me for the computer exemption, even if I do make this amount of money. I'm going to need to fit into some other exemption if I'm going to be exempt from the FLSA. So at this point in time, we have completed both the overtime wages section and the exemptions that we have with FLSA. We're really through the first part of our FLSA analysis, the part about wages. And now in our next lecture, we will talk about the child labor protections. And we'll also talk just very briefly about the Equal Pay Act, since we've already talked about that in another statute. Another presentation. The Equal Pay Act, as you probably remember, have to do with differentials between the wages of women and men who are doing the same type of work. And finally, in another lecture, we will talk about the Texas wage statutes. I hope that this presentation has been helpful for you. As always, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. My email is cgroover@collin.edu. Or better yet, stop by. I would be delighted to talk to you in more detail about the ins and outs of the FLSA or any other statute. Thanks for your attention, and I hope that you have a wonderful day. Take care.